Hello and welcome to SAM Conversation, the video program of South Asia Monitor. I am Tarun Basu and I'll be in conversation today with Commodore Uday Bhaskar, India's preeminent strategic analyst. And since we are largely focused on South Asia and the Indo-Pacific, the most important and seminal geopolitical event this week has been the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit in the eastern Chinese port city of Tianjin. The organization has grown in strength. It was started as, I think, half a dozen countries, and I think in Tianjin there were about 20 global leaders in attendance, including heads of government of Russia, heads of state and government of Russia, China, of course, the host, India, Turkey, and Central Asian countries, and Pakistan, of course, is also part of this grouping. The optics from the summit, as far as India is concerned, has been fairly positive. And the summit has sent a lot of signals to a lot of world capitals that have, I think, followed the summit and the messages coming from it quite keenly. Prime Minister Modi has been seen in animated conversation with President Xi Jinping, whom he met after 5 years or 7 years, I think. And the first time that the two were meeting after the borders clashes in eastern Ladakh in 2020. They had met, I think 4 months ago in Kazan, but this was a much more structured meeting. And in fact, as some media were recording the number of times they met, I think this is the 20th meeting between Prime Minister Modi and President Xi Jinping since Mr. Modi came to power in 2014. The two were seen broadly smiling when they met. Xi Jinping, in his remarks, talked about that the two countries should be partners, not rivals. Mr. Modi talked about that the 2.8 billion people of both countries were looking to work together, and the cooperation would be important for the future of the two countries and this future of Asia. Then there was this famous photograph, which was again pictured around the world, of Mr. Modi in conversation, animated conversation with President Putin of Russia and President Xi Jinping. And it led to a lot of talk of our RIC axis, Russia, India, China axis. Talking about optics, President Putin gave a ride to Prime Minister Modi in his limo. This to spook for not just 15 minutes in the ride from the hotel to the summit venue, but also stayed on in the car for another 45, 50 minutes to have a one-on-one conversation, which was again of great importance. Now, what are the messages that this conversations and the larger summit gave to the outside world? And here, Uday, I would like to bring you in to give us a larger perspective, especially what happened to India and the Trump tariffs and the 50% tariffs on India and the kind of signaling that Tianjin has given to Washington and other world capitals. Uday?
Thanks, Tarun, for inviting me to be part of this conversation. And as you have indicated in your very comprehensive overview, the Tianjin Summit, the SCO, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, is indeed a very consequential summit in terms of the geopolitical implications and signaling, the word that you used. And I would characterize it as being very rich in the symbolism at two levels. One, of course, is the bilateral, between India and China, where Prime Minister Modi had a one-on-one with President Xi Jinping. And we saw the statement, definitely from the Indian side, was very upbeat and optimistic about what you might call as the beginning of a thaw in the India-China bilateral, which had gone into deep freeze after Galwan in mid-2020. So that's almost 5 years. Yes, Prime Minister Modi and President Xi Jinping met on the sidelines in Kazan, Russia, at the previous summit, but that was a very short meeting, very brief meeting. But in a way, it paved the way. Kazan paved the way for Tianjin, where the agreements that had been identified broadly when the Chinese Foreign Minister, Mr. Wang Yi, came to Delhi in the end of August, those have been formalized. So, in many ways, I would describe the first bilateral between India and China as significant, rich in terms of the potential it holds for both countries to be able to work together. As of now, I'd be a bit cautious and just say that what it has led to is an improvement so that the relationship that had been stalled, a dialogue that had been stalled, has now been brought back on track. Because there are a number of contentious issues that India and China have to address. The starting point is Galwan. I mean, what was Galwan? Galwan was a manifestation of this very complex territorial and border dispute. So now it's back at least on the dialogue table. So that I would say is the first, big takeaway at the bilateral level. The second, I would say, relates to the larger multilateral, which is what the SCO was all about, which China was hosting. It was a very big event for President Xi Jinping personally, against the backdrop of both the Ukraine war and the kind of pressure that US President Donald Trump is seeking to apply on China also, as far as tariffs and the relationship with Russia are concerned. So I would describe it as rich in symbolism at two levels. There's a lot that we can unpack in terms of what President Xi Jinping said in his opening remarks and what President Putin said, what Prime Minister Modi said in terms of the content of the SCO itself. Tarun?
Talking about the bilaterals first, can we say this is leading to a reset in relationship between India and China? I mean, the two sides have agreed to relax their relationship in a number of ways. The visas are being resumed, the flights are being resumed, and China is, I think, lifting its export restrictions on some critical items for India, the rare earth magnets, fertilizers, boring equipment for boring equipment for tunnels, etc. This which India needed badly. But there have been critical voices in the Indian media because of the way the things have been worded. Not too many months ago, you would remember, Foreign Minister Jaishankar talked about the centrality of the border issue and said that unless the border issue was settled, the things between India and China cannot go back to normal. But now what we read, what we have seen from the statement so far, is that the border issue, if I might put it that way, has not been settled. There has been some this thing pullback of troops, but there has been no de-escalation. There's no de-escalation, and both sides have agreed that the border issues are still much there, but China would like to keep it to the back burner, which has always been saying, and said and wanted that the other issues, the resumption of ties and the normalization and development of ties should not be held hostage to the border issue. But India always wanted to make the border issue, the centrality of the border issue, and said that ties cannot be normalized until the border was settled. So do you think here India has kind of softened on this issue because of the larger geopolitical churns that are happening, especially the push and pulls from Washington?
Yeah, I think that would be a fair description, that the word I would choose for describing the outcome of the bilateral between Modi and Xi Jinping would be a case of restoring a degree of normalcy in the bilateral, because the bilateral got ruptured in Galwan in 2020. And all the kind of, shall we say, breakdown that takes place in the bilateral is in that period from Galwan to Tianjin. Post Tianjin, what we are seeing is, number one, the resumption of dialogue, which was preceded by the two foreign ministers, Wang Yi and Jaishankar, as also Ajit Doval and Wang Yi both wearing the hat of the special representative to discuss the border issue. So I'm repeating this, it is the resumption or a restoration of a degree of normalcy. But on this second part, I agree with you. India has always said, Jaishankar has said this many times, that we want a restoration of the status quo that prevailed before Galwan. All the reading that I have done, the Indian statement is a single statement by India. There was no joint statement after the bilateral meeting, and rightly so, because this was not a summit. This was a meeting on the sidelines. But the readout from Beijing is a little more circumspect. It's a little more, I would say, doesn't give the meeting the kind of optics that we in India seem to have done, particularly some sections of the audiovisual media. I would say, as an analyst, and I have been accused in the past of being cynical, being jaundiced, and not joining the cheerleaders, but I think we have to proceed very cautiously and see how the disengagement that we have seen at Galwan will actually lead to substantive de-escalation and pullback, and will India have the same patrolling rights that it did before Galwan? As of now, I don't get that sense, because if you remember, even after Kazan, India was very upbeat that there was some kind of a movement, but the buffer zones were introduced. So all that has happened, as I see it, is that the temperature, the military temperature tension, or the eyeball to eyeball between the troops has been brought down. But whether or not India is actually able to return to pre-Galwan in terms of the patrolling and the status quo, at this point, the perhaps most polite way of describing it is that it's a work in progress. So we have to see, but definitely I think India has been more malleable in wanting to reach out. And I dare say, even on the Chinese side, President Xi Jinping wanted a successful SCO summit. Imagine if Mr. Modi, Prime Minister, had not gone. That would not have been the right optics. So I think China also had a lot of investment at the political and diplomatic level. Now look at, yesterday I saw the international media, most of them were leading, particularly TV news, with the SCO summit. So that just shows that it has the potential to be an alternative to what President Donald Trump is trying to, in a way, advance as his vision of the global order, which also means the weaponization of tariffs. Tarun?
In fact, the American media has paid a lot of attention to this summit, and most of the TV channels and newspapers have given a lot of coverage to the meetings between Modi and Xi, and between Modi, Putin, and Xi Jinping, and talked about how Trump has driven Modi into Chinese arms. But really, is that the case, do you think? Or it has been more about the fact that India also needed more for economic reasons than political to have some kind of rapprochement with China. And this was going to happen, some kind of stabilization was going to take place. Disengagement in Galwan had happened, but although there's no de escalation on the table, but this was going to happen anyway. Is it what has happened in Tianjin? Is it because of Trump, or there's a process that has been accelerated possibly by Trump and his tariffs?
Well, again, I think I would describe it in the following manner, that the beginning of an improvement in the India-China bilateral, to my mind, began in Kazan which is last year, 2024, where she and Modi met on the sidelines. Then, I think from then to now, 2024 to 2025, we saw President Trump entering the White House for his second term. And the steady kind of intimidation of India and other countries, where President Trump was using the tariff as a weapon. And I think specific to India, the brief India-Pakistan war and the fact that India did not accept the Trump formulation that he had, in a way, been responsible for, quote unquote, stopping the war and therefore he should be nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. India did not sign up to that as enthusiastically as Pakistan did. So in a way, you see the introduction of the personal element fatigue. And because of that, I think the improvement in the Sino-Indian relationship, India-China, was definitely catalyzed. So I think it would be wrong to suggest that the improvement has happened only because of Trump, but perhaps
it might have got accelerated. The process might have got accelerated.
But this does not mean that India is now going to, again, the word you used, will India embrace China? I think the answer is no. Will India sever its relations with America? The answer is no. Because if we go back to the starting point, India was buying oil from Russia because it was in India's national interest. Today, India's national interest is best served by remaining in contact with the United States, as India has. We still have a dialogue going on defense, on technology, on the non-tariff trade, because America is a very important interlocutor for India. And I keep saying this, that there is life after Trump for the bilateral relationship. Many Americans are saying that there is life for America after Trump. So I think the domestic discord in America also is a major factor. But for now, my reading is India is going to open a dialogue with China. We are not embracing China. India is going to deal with America in a way where it will draw its own red lines. But this does not mean severing relations with the United States, though Trump, mind you, is doing everything he can to make life tough for India. The fact that he has announced 60,000 visas for Chinese students in just one kind of decision, and the impact will be on the Indian students who would not get the visa that will now go to the Chinese. So, these are the kind of, I would say, pinpricks that India would have to deal with for the next 3 years, 3.5 years, till Mr. Trump is in the White House.
But given the fact that the American media gave a lot of attention to the Tianjin summit, and the fact a lot of them panned President Trump for the way he treated India, a fellow democracy, and trying to rupture and having ruptured a relationship that had taken 25 years in the making and at the level it stands today. Do you think there would be Trump would have some rethink on the way the whole thing has developed and the way he has treated India? If not, Prime Minister Modi himself?
At this point, I think President Trump doesn't have enough of an incentive to revisit and review because, logic and the conduct of bilateral relations in a normative sense doesn't seem to be his USP. He's a deal maker. So he's looking for some deal that would also burnish his image in the domestic constituency. For instance, the last time I saw a program about him, he was taking a lot of credit for making the NATO countries increase their defense budget and buy American arms. This was in relation to the war in Ukraine. He was seeing this as a big win. But I think what could cause or trigger the difference and make him review his policies is if the American consumer is hit by the tariff war, because this tariff war is not just India. India and Brazil are at 50%, but he has also identified American allies, including Japan, including Western European countries like Germany and France and Britain and so on. And similarly, countries like South Korea, Australia, so-called allies. So when the American consumer starts feeling the pinch, suppose prices go up. There was a scare that if Canada decides that it will not play ball with America, then basic products would also be affected. I think when that happens, we will see it politically in the elections to the House of Representatives. Because after all, both for Mr. Modi and for Mr. Trump, it's about domestic politics. Whatever they are doing will be to ensure that their own base and their electoral, shall we say, positioning is positive for them. So my reading is that I think Mr. Trump will revisit if there is an impact on his own profile. And the American consumer and the American citizen says enough is enough and that we need to have a more rational policy.
You spoke about Japan. The road to Tianjin for India was to Tokyo because Prime Minister Modi paid an official visit to Japan before he came to Tianjin, before he came to China. And there were a number of important economic and security related agreements there. And that also sent a lot of signaling because in the context of Quad, because and the reports have come from Washington that President Trump may not attend the Quad summit, which was scheduled to be held in New Delhi later this year. So if President Trump gives it a miss, and there's a good understanding between India, Australia, and Japan. And do you think there's a possibility that at least the three of the other countries, Australia, Japan, and India, could still meet in New Delhi in order to send a signal to Washington that the Quad is still alive, maybe as a triad, and maybe U.S. Washington needs to review its policies, because
There are
both
2 points.
Australia and Japan
Yeah,
have strong
yeah.
relationships with US.
There are 2 points here, Tarun. I think number one, you're spot on. The bilateral meeting between India and Japan, where Prime Minister Modi had met with his Japanese counterpart, I think was a very important meeting in terms of the signal it sent to China. Because the foundation for India and Japan is that they have always been concerned that China wants a unipolar Asia. China does not want, in my view, the emergence of either Japan or India or Japan and India as credible poles in Asia. China is seeking quote unquote democracy at the global level where they want to be treated on par with the United States and have a G2. But in Asia, they want unipolarity. But at the global level, they want bipolarity, which is fine. This is the Chinese preference or Chinese, shall we say, way of looking at the world. So I think India and Japan are deeply aware of that. If you remember, then Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, when he had started the whole Indo-Pacific and the connectivity of the oceans, was a shared anxiety about China, which then morphed into the Quad. But at this point in time, I think President Trump is unlikely to come to India personally for the Quad. So that will be, I think, a very tepid affair. It will not be the Quad. But again, neither would Japan or Australia antagonize Trump because they know that he gets very hassled on personal issues. So if he sees that as an affront to him, I think neither the Australian Prime Minister nor the Japanese Prime Minister want to go down that path. They, I think, would try to keep it very, very low level in terms of the engagement with India. But this does not remove the challenge for the United States that China poses in the maritime and naval domain, which is why I keep saying that there is life after Trump. China is not going to disappear. The Chinese Navy will become even more formidable. We will have the whole impact of artificial intelligence and new technology on the global maritime domain, in space, in cyber. And that is when I think the tea leaves, as far as global geopolitics and Asian geopolitics are concerned, will have to be seen very, very carefully. Tarun?
You spoke about the fact that, being the host country, China and President Xi Jinping wanted naturally to make the Tianjin summit a success. And so also in terms of takeaways for India, the there was in the joint declaration, there was a mention of the Pahalgaon terror attack, and there was all-round unanimous condemnation of the Pahalgaon terror attack, which was not there, if you remember, 4 months ago in the defense ministers meeting, which led to Defense Minister Rajnath Singh not being a signatory to the final declaration. So there was a softening of stand. There was a kind of, or rather to use your word, malleability on the part of China. in terms of bringing in agreeing to the Indian formulation on the condemnation of the Pahalgam terror attack. But at the same time, there was also mention of the Jaffa Express train attack, which again, as you know, Pakistan has alluded that there is a foreign hand in it, and said that India could have been, also involved. So the fact that both Pahalgam and Jaffa Express, in terms of terror and the battle against terror is concerned, that they were both brought into the final declaration. What does that signify?
Well, basically, I would say in summary that it's a kind of balancing act for Beijing also. Because as we said, for Beijing, it was important that Prime Minister Modi be at the summit. But while he was there, I think Pakistan also had to be accommodated. So I think this final language, I was reading some reports from China also that some Chinese reports seem to suggest that India played very hardball. And finally, there was a lot of brinkmanship to arrive at a language that would be acceptable to Beijing, to Delhi, and Rawalpindi. Because remember, it's General Munir and Rawalpindi who has become the most relevant player.
He also happens to have come to Beijing and on the Chinese Communist Party invitation for the military parade, grand military parade.
So I think for India, it was a limited kind of, I would say, advancement of the Indian position, because Pakistan was not identified as supporting terrorism, which is what India has long maintained. So I think Beijing has found some kind of a modus vivendi, which is why, where we started, I said that we have to only cautiously welcome the takeaways from Tianjin.
So how would you sum up the whole summit and the fact that both India, Prime Minister Modi had very successful meetings, or what was seen to be very successful meetings with his Chinese, with his Russian, with his Turkish and other counterparts. So what is the outlook for South Asia and for Indo-Pacific post the SCO summit in Tianjin?
My sort of conclusion would be that Tianjin is to be cautiously welcomed, both for the improvement in the bilateral and for the broader signal being sent by the global community, represented in this case by China as the host country, that there are voices outside which are not going to accept the kind of intimidation that President Trump is currently engaging in. Because at the end of the day, the SCO represents almost 42% of global population and about 24% of global GDP. So it's a voice that I think is being heard. And tomorrow is the parade, September 3rd. And there my sense is that China will again display its military muscle. President Xi will have President Putin, the Russian president, with him, as also the North Korean leader, perhaps Iran, etc., would also be given a place. So I think you can see the emergence of the equivalent of a cluster of leaders whose orientation is anti-US. And India does not want to be in that particular basket, which is why I'm repeating this. India will not sever relations with America, nor will it embrace China in an uncritical manner, is my reading of Tianjin. Tarun?
But India can certainly play the role of a balancer, as some analysts have predicted. India has good terms with this, obviously, and India is not going to rupture its relationship with the US in any way. And I'm sure back channel talks are already on. And India has good relations with everybody. And there's a message that India has sent to the world that it is not a zero-sum game, and that good relations with China, good relations with Russia, good relations with the US, good relations with the EU are all in India's national interest. And India has the strategic autonomy to decide what is in its national interest and what is not. And no country has the right to decide, leave alone the US, about who it should sup with and who it should trade with. Am I correct?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that would be a very, appropriate summary.
Well, that was nice having you there. And I think
Thank you.
we had an interesting conversation. Thank you. And thank you on behalf of South Asia Money.
Thank you.